Hello. Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. I'm Melissa Fisher-Isaacs. I'm the Information Services Coordinator here at the Lawrence Public Library, and I'm excited to welcome you to the fourth in our four-part series on Civic Engagement 101. We've been excited to partner with the League of Women Voters of Lawrence and Douglas County and Humanities Kansas to bring you this series. Our goal with this really is to bring you unbiased and nonpartisan information on the issues on this November's ballot and to help you understand your rights as voters. This session is being streamed over Zoom and will be recorded and available on the library's YouTube channel. And the first three sessions are available now on the library's YouTube channel. Tonight's session is made possible by the generous support of Humanities Kansas, and I'd like to turn the mic over the Humanities Kansas board member and LPL director, Brad Allen, for a few words before I introduce tonight's speaker.
Hi, thanks so much for being here. As Melissa said, I'm Brad Allen. I'm the director here at Lawrence Public Library, but today I'm putting on a second or another hat as a board member of Humanities Kansas. Humanities Kansas, if you're not familiar, is leading a movement of ideas across Kansas in partnership with public libraries, museums, and other organizations around the state. Together, we're exploring history, ideas, traditions, and literature, and making important connections between people and place over time and across generations. This year is a special one in that it marks the 50th anniversary of Humanities Kansas, and this month is also National Arts and Humanities Month. Since our founding, this library and many other organizations here in Lawrence have partnered with Humanities Kansas on numerous times over the decades to host speakers bureaus, events, and lots of other programming. So this is clearly a community that enjoys an exchange of ideas. That would be an understatement. I am here today to say thank you on behalf of Humanities Kansas. Thank you to local coordinators who make these events happen and the speakers who share their knowledge. And thank you to all of you in the audience who come and support this work. If you'd like more information about Humanities Kansas, there are newsletters, buttons, and other materials on your chairs here. And also one other thing that we've been asked to do for social media for Humanities Kansas is try to get like a little bit of a photo of some of the folks holding this lovely "We Love Humanity" sign. If you'd indulge us, I don't know, where do you think would be the, it's kind of going to get in there somewhere with them. All right. I'll turn it back over to Melissa to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Brad, and thank you for humoring us. So I'm pleased to introduce tonight's speaker. Hannes Zacharias currently serves as the Robert A. Kipp Professor of Practice in Public Administration at KU here in Lawrence. He has over 35 years of experience in city and county government in jurisdictions both small and large, holding positions such as the Management Analyst for the City of Lawrence, City Manager for the City of Hayes, and Assistant County Manager, Deputy County Manager, and County Manager for Johnson County, Kansas. Please welcome Hannes Zacharias.
Good. Great. Thank you so much for leading me be here this evening and talk to you about local governments as we get started here. I am Hannes Zacharias. I don't know how this works. How do we advance this? This way? Does that work? Yeah, Hannes Zacharias, Professor of Practice here at KU. This is my information, my contact information. If you want to go ahead and visit with me, we'll also show it at the end as well. But happy to go and do this here on behalf of Humanities Kansas. What I want to have you do at the beginning, though, I have some note cards here, and I find it helpful that if you want to indulge me, I guess, and maybe David, you can help. If you have a topic or question, so forth, you really want me to go ahead and cover about local governments, please write it down and let me know. And we'll have a break in the middle here, about 50 minutes till 7. We're going to go till 7:30. So we'll end on time as far as that's concerned, do a 5-minute break. But there's so many topics that we can talk about for local government that I want to make sure that we cover those things that you have an interest in specific questions. I can talk about a lot of different things that would really be helpful as far as that is concerned. The agenda this evening we're going to be doing is I'm going to talk about my background real briefly. I'm going to talk about local government background historically, give you some context of that, both for counties and for cities. We'll talk about the myriad of services that both entities do. Then we'll talk about taxes, broad brush, where revenue comes in, property taxes, sales taxes, and other areas of revenue resource to give you an understanding where finances go. And then topics of your special interest. That's what I want to have you write down on your note card so I get a chance to understand where you want to take the conversation. And we'll have time also for discussion at the end as well. So first of all, with my background, as you said earlier, what started out here in Lawrence, Kansas back in 1985. My mentor was Buford Watson. I always get a thrill when I see the park there after my mentor at that point in time, and learned a great deal. I came to that position after I'd worked for the federal government and also for the state government as well. So I have that experience also that I can add to the conversation. After about 4 years in wonderful Lawrence, I guess one thing I'll reveal is you've seen a downtown sculpture project. That was one of my projects from years ago. So helped me put that in place, which was great to see that continue. I then went from that point to Boonville, Missouri. If you know where that is, it's on the Missouri River, 3 interchanges on I-70. Was there for several years, helped bring in a new bridge into the community and bring the Main Street program for downtown revitalization. After 4 years there, I got a chance to go to Hays, America. We don't call it Hays, Kansas. We call it Hays, America. And learned a great deal about water. I won't talk to you about this evening about water, but I could talk to you for hours about how to get water, how to purify water, how to witch for water, how to get water out of the clouds, water policy, all those sort of things. But it was a great experience. And after 10 years, I had a chance to go ahead and move up the ladder as we're typical to do in the public management profession, and was applying and got in a position to go to a suburb in the Denver area. And I give a call from Johnson County, Kansas. And they said, we have a position open for an assistant county manager. And I said, you haven't applied for it. And I said, well, why should I? I'm a small town, you're a large community, you're wet, I'm dry, you're a county, I'm a city, why should I do this sort of thing? He said, apply anyway, which I really I'm glad I did. I then got hired as assistant county manager, then deputy county manager, then county manager for about 10 years. So over 35 years, 33 years in what we call the ICMA world. So that's why you should listen to me. After I left Johnson County and did a kayak trip, which is a whole different conversation, KU asked me to go ahead and become a professor of practice. And I'm really happy to go ahead and do that because I really want to foster and nurture the next generation of public servants. That's a passion of mine. That kind of gives you some of my background here about what my bona fides might be about why you should listen to me and what I think I can add to the conversation and answer some of your questions. Let's talk about the history, a little bit about local governments, general history of county governments in general, and then cities kind of being part of that. As you talk about county governments, you have to go back to England, back to the 5th century about how counties got established. We imported that as we immigrated over from the new world, from the old world into the new world. We actually, the term county comes from a modification of terms over language from the Germans, that being Skyria, meaning care of an official charge. There were shires that way, that kind of working that. Why that's important is because that then kind of morphed into the shire and the shire reeve, which was a person that was elected by the serfs to watch over the information, or the collection of taxes, et cetera. So the principal involved would go ahead and say, please, shire reeve, go out there and get all the taxes and be the intermediary between the local individuals, and the king or queen or duke of that area. That got morphed into the sheriff. So now you can see where indeed how we got the term sheriff and how the sheriff kind of becomes part of our lexicon here. That got the term shire then changed to county with the Norman conquest. Becomes a French term, right? So then we become county at that point and work from that. When we came over back in the 1600s, we didn't have counties, we had shires. In fact, the first 8 shires were that part of the Virginia colony and then transferred over into counties. So it is a legacy that comes to us from England and from Europe that gets transported over here into the United States. So where does we know that the Constitution of the United States mentions nothing about counties, right? How we get counties is because of the issues of the 10th Amendment, which basically says that the powers that are not delegated directly to the United States in the Constitution or prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states. So it becomes a state function about how counties are created. So in essence, that becomes the area of local jurisdiction for the entire country. In fact, the county is the largest territorial division for a local government within the state of the United States. Everybody lives within a county or a parish in the United States. You can't say that by virtue of a city, but that is the area that so we have a layered here, right? We have the layering with regards to the United States. Obviously, you have the layering of the state within your which, and then within which you live. Then you also have the county. So everybody has that kind of layer of bureaucracy right now. This is what the county structure looks like across the country. And what I find fascinating about this particular map is look how the size of counties are on the eastern seaboard versus the western part of the country. And you can see they're much, much larger in there. Look at Nevada being an example of that. And that's because we got better at administration about how far we can go ahead and manage our jurisdictions going forward as we did it. County structures also on the east are a little bit different than the west. County structures not only deal with our traditional things of elections and tax assessment and those sort of things, but also schools and hospitals are also part typically of county operations on the East Coast, less so in the Midwest, and even kind of more really out west as well. Statistics are 47 of the 50 states have functioning county governments. 3 states are without those. Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Connecticut are more really geographical jurisdictions than they are administrative jurisdictions, kind of like townships, if you will. But every place else in the country becomes much more, they still exist, but their authority is much more limited. Counties are also called parishes or boroughs in Alaska. By population, the smallest is in Hawaii of 88 people, and the largest is Los Angeles by population over 10 million people. You might recall that there's no Los Angeles City Police. There's a Los Angeles Sheriff's Department that really governs that community. By area, the smallest is Arlington County, Virginia, 26 miles, and the largest in Alaska is 87,000 square miles. The jurisdictions are wide-ranging as that goes on. Kansas Constitution does give us some clarity as far as counties are concerned. Counties, it does indeed, they're ongoing operations. So the state of Kansas establishes how counties will be established. It tells you about how large they should be and sets up that whole administrative procedure. Each county, we have in Kansas 105 counties, and they act as the local government for residents living in its boundaries. All county authority is granted by the state as a county, and a county is considered a subdivision of the state. That's important because county commissioners and county officials are now state employees, if you will. So there are some restrictions about what occurs for those particular employees working for county government. County governments also, you can see across the map here, in 105 counties, the small dots is where the indeed county seat is. And the important thing about this is let's notice where that we're virtually in the center of each individual county. So it kind of gives you a sense it was done on purpose to go ahead and provide that level of connections and transportation to go back and forth to the county seat. Let's give you some ideas about how counties expanded historically in Kansas. The hashed area talks about the area that actually counties were part of our jurisdiction prior to the state being a state. So we had counties together before 1861. And you can see those are the yellow hash marks as we try to govern ourselves as the state came into fruition. 1861 to 1869 are the dark grays, and the light grays becomes those between 1870 and 79, and the white is from 1880 on or later. So you can see the western expansion in that kind of progression for Kansas for our 105 counties. Well, how did we get 105 counties? What was the biggest factor in determining how big counties in Kansas should be? Any guesses about that? Yeah, man. Exactly, on horseback. Exactly right. How far you could go on horseback in one day to conduct your business. Either you then can go off in the outskirts to go ahead and get adjudications done, or manage your funds and those sort of things. So the central location of a county, or the county seat, was important. Now, there are many historical documents about the county seat wars. The idea, I know in Ford County, where I grew up as a kid, there were people stealing from Buckland to come back to Dodge City, and the feeling was wherever the safe was that resided, that's where the county seat was going to go ahead and be. And yes, there are places you kind of just go in and rob the safe and bring it back to home, and that was where the county seat was, where those things were occurred. So that kind of gives you a sense of why we have 105. I would admit today, or I submit today, that having that kind of a process of how far you can travel on horseback is indeed archaic, right? Probably not very useful today, but try to go ahead and change those boundaries. Virtually impossible. People have a sense of identity, even though there's no physical remnant there. It's a geographical designation of a line that has no truth in geology or geomorphology, which I find really interesting, as you be kind of welded to this compass heading versus where a river might be, or a hillside, or rocks, or anything might be in the place. But so be it, that's what you have. There are extremes in Kansas of the counties. 151 square miles for Wyandotte County, and Butler County, being the largest county, is over 1,400 square miles, was a kind of a morphed into a large county that way. There are restrictions now. The Constitution requires to have basically 432 square miles around there as things go forward. Populations, 1,200 people out farther west in the counties, and Johnson County is out actually now up to about 609,000 and climbing as we go forward here. So local governments in Kansas, let's talk about the number of local governments we have in what sort of context. 3,800 from almost 4,000 local jurisdictions. People tell me we don't like government in Kansas, and I say baloney. We like it in spades. We like local government, we like local control. Whenever in doubt, we go ahead and create another district, all of which are elected, all of which have a certain portion of our property tax pie. We'll talk about that later on. But it gives you the sense of the number of jurisdictions that we have. Counties, cities, townships, school districts, community college, and then a raft of special districts that we'll talk about as we go forward. What would those special districts look like? Well, here's kind of a taste of those. You have cemetery districts, you have fire districts, hospital districts, drainage districts, watershed districts, sewer districts, library districts, obviously, irrigation districts, water conservation districts. In some other states, we have mosquito eradication districts, all of which have board of directors, all of which indeed have elections for their purposes and get put into place. So that gives you a sense of the context. This is kind of the overlaying of that. I think this actually is Wichita, but you can see the various jurisdictions here, the fire districts and so forth that come into play. So it is a layer cake of responsibility, federal, state, county, and then all these little kind of little peaks come into play that overlap as far as what the jurisdiction is going to be, which becomes a real monumental task for those who are doing assessments and appraising and tax collections as we go forward. Counties have two major roles to go ahead and do in Kansas. The first is to serve as the administrative arm of state government. So one of the state government is only in session for a set amount of time, 3 to 4 months a year, depending on how the sessions go. As they create this thing, they established, give that work over to the executive authority. The governor sets those things up, but they don't provide all the services. They primarily do that through contractual arrangements. When the state of Kansas wanted to try to increase its hold on child care centers and so forth, they did it through a contract with public health departments to go ahead and do that administration. They don't have a cadre of individuals to do that kind of work. So we are the counties, I say we because it's hard to go ahead and not say we when we've been doing local government management. Counties basically are the extension, they're the local government arm of the state governments and ubiquitously applied. The second thing is to provide locally determined services. So were Lawrence not to be around or available, the governmental jurisdiction you would have would be the county. Now, cities are put in place as a way to go ahead and augment the services that a county would provide additional services beyond what those normally would be provided otherwise. But were Lawrence to go away, then the jurisdiction falls to the county to provide those services as required by state statutes. As an administrative arm of the state government, counties administer election processes. We've heard a lot about that, right? So each county has their own election process. All 105 counties have election commissioners. For those 100 counties are by virtue of the elected treasurer in those positions becomes the election officers. For 5 counties in Kansas, they are appointed by the Secretary of State, including Douglas County. So Johnson, Douglas, Shawnee, Wyandotte, and Sedgwick County are all appointed by the Secretary of State, done several years ago to provide some level of expertise to go ahead and provide electioneering activity. Handling many taxation processes, including property appraisal, collection, distribution, neighborhood districts, industrial revenue bonds, tax exemptions, etc. All that's being administered by the county. Issues, license and permits as needed and provided for. Maintain land records. If the record that you have in your house is not in the county records, it doesn't exist. That's the bottom line. That's why the idea of having your records and who had the safe was so important back in the 1880s, because if it doesn't have proof that way, there's nothing that exists. How many of you have ever looked at your abstract for your house or your property if you have property? Yeah, so what's page 1? Page 1 is the Louisiana Purchase. That's where all these things start out, at least in this part of the world. So the abstract is designed as a way to be a historical record of indeed who had the property for you. And you buy title insurance as a way to say if somebody else comes in and said, no, back in 1875, somebody else didn't get that right property, then indeed they could usurp your right to that property. And that's why you have title insurance, to make sure you get compensated if indeed that abstract is inaccurate, right? But the basic of that is, does it exist in the county records or not? Doesn't exist there, you don't have it, okay? Provide facilities, equipment for the judiciary. Counties are required to go ahead and pay for the facilities, but not for the administration of justices. That was done about 30, 40 years ago as a compromise to say basically that we will go ahead and organize the state of Kansas, all the judges. We'll pay for the judges being required. I guess you got to be an attorney. It's a good idea to be a judge. We'll regularize that, normalize those activities, and we'll pay for those people, but you got to pay for the facilities. So the courthouse itself, those sort of things are all county facilitated. That's different than in the state of California, where California pays for everything. The state does. The courthouse itself, as well as the adjudication and administration of those sort of things. Finance, prosecution, county and district attorneys are all part of it by the county as well. Now, these are kind of some administrative services, but there are also mandated services that the county has to provide. Public health is one. Every county is required to go and have a public health department, and typically in Kansas, except for in Douglas County, the county commissioners are themselves the public health department as well, or Board of Public Health. And we've all known now about that by virtue of COVID-19, how important that position is. I had the opportunity to serve as the co-chair of the Regional Homeland Security Coordinating Committee for the Kansas City region. And we often talked about prior to COVID-19 about the use of those really large statutes for quarantine and so forth being very heavy and being needed, that were put in place basically after the 1918 pandemic. Mental health services are required for each county to provide. Developmental supports for those who are developmentally disabled is required by the counties. Now, there are funds that come from the state of Kansas as well to help augment that, but the counties often have to augment that to go and make those services appropriate. Emergency management. I know Lawrence has an emergency management department as well, but the statutory responsibility is with the county of Douglas County to do the emergency management. Who fires off the sirens and those sort of things? Who makes the declarations going on? The county is the chief point of contact for all that kind of work. Solid waste planning, not the collection of solid waste, but the planning of solid waste statewide, figuring out where the waste is going to go and how's it going to be paid for and how's it going to be continued on in the future. Where's the landfill going to be, or landfills going to be? Is going to transport it out west? You're going to go ahead and do another landfill? That planning is required by the state of Kansas. Law enforcement and jails. The primary responsibility for county sheriffs is for the jails, which consumes a great deal of personnel and those sort of things. So that's a county responsibility to make sure that the jail is put in place. Remember what jail is used for. Jail is used for to ensure that indeed you show up to court. Sometimes it's used to go ahead and pay for with regards to some sort of recuperation or for criminal justice administration and incarceration purposes for offenses. But it's typically used by virtue of making sure people show up to court. That's what jail is for. Unless you're given a release on your own recognizance and so forth. Transportation. Roads, bridges, all those sort of things, responsibility for the county as well, including transit responsibilities. That's how Johnson County does transit. Those sort of things, responsibility for the county. Noxious weed eradication sounds kind of low level, but let's talk about it in Western Kansas. We have that in Johnson County as well. Noxious weeds taking over the farmland areas and really reducing viable production of farmland through the entire county. Responsibility, and that's a mandated requirement coming on. There are some additional requirements or things that counties can do with regards to locally determined things. Hospitals would be one of those. We have several counties that have hospitals as well. Various medical services, home health care services, assisted care, nursing care. Johnson County still helps support a nursing home as a remnant of what used to be called the poor farm. Literally, that was what it was called. People who did not have services lived on the poor farm and did subsistence living until they found other means to go and make that work. Cultural and leisure services, parks, zoos, museums, cultural facilities would be out of that. Economic development. Some counties are very vigorous in economic development. Most of the economic development in Kansas occurs by cities. Some is done by counties, but most is indeed done in cities. Planning and zoning, airports, utilities, sewers, etc. Johnson County has sewers. Many counties do not have those things, but they're optional services going forward. Let's talk about counties that do have county hospitals, mostly out west, right? Which one would think to go and support that the population is being so low there needs to be some sort of level of county subsidy to make sure that those services are provided adequately. I've been perusing, and I love doing it. If you're not doing it, you should look at it. The recent edition of the Kansas Statistical Abstract just came out, which really kind of lines out almost 600 pages of great data for us data geeks. It's really kind of fun to read through. But it kind of talks about Medicare services, Medicaid services, where hospitals are, where hospitals are not, the level of care and the number of physicians per 1,000 people or 100 people. There are many counties in Kansas that do not have any physicians at all, which is sobering. It also talks about demographic statistics as well, some small tidbit in looking at that. Let's talk about population. Population has decreased in all of 105 counties but 7. Median age for some counties has about 65 to 68% of the people over 65 in some of the counties. So it becomes a really kind of difficult deal out in rural Kansas to go ahead and maintain services in those situations. Growth areas, you can imagine, it's Douglas County, it's Johnson County, it's Wyandotte County, it's Shawnee County, it's Sedgwick County. That's where people are all migrating to as we go forward as a state. Counties with zoning, you'd think that zoning would be a commonplace. It's not. About half the state does not have zoning. So buyer beware. Example for me in Ellis County is that there are individuals that are out in the county because they they wanted to avoid zoning. Beautiful subdivision gets put out place in the county. Nice roads and so forth, septic tanks and those sort of things. A hog farm comes right across the fence. People were outraged. There's no zoning. You didn't want to have zoning, so you're okay. You get what you don't want to have. Those sort of things. That did force the Ellis Commission eventually to say there should be zoning to kind of protect property owners as far as that's going on. Additionally, without zoning, there's no building requirements, no building permits required, no codes to reinforce. Where does that come into place? Also in Ellis County, there was a beautiful house built out in the county. They hosted a party, which was great. Nice big back porch, about 20 or 30 people on the porch. The porch collapsed. They said, well, how's that possible? Well, because there's no building code. You didn't want to have the restrictions of the government. You get that. So that kind of lets you know that counties are not required to have zoning. Some do, some do not. A very, very hotly contested debate eventually in Ellis County by those who are really property advocates. But eventually I think there was a desire to go and have zoning going in that community. Let's talk about governance structures for counties particularly. Board of County Commissioners varies in sizes between 3, 5, and 7 members. Douglas County here has 3. Johnson County has 7. Board sizes can be changed by referendum should the county decide to do that. There probably is a slight trend toward getting to larger, I think, county commissioners, particularly in those areas that are larger in population, to allow a little bit more services that way. Special legislation in Johnson, Wyandotte, and Greeley counties allowed that to occur. And directly elected board chairs both in Johnson and Wyandotte counties. Otherwise, they're elected by districts. You see that here in Douglas County, whereas Johnson County has 7 commissioners. There are 6 districts in the county, and the 7th district is the entire county itself. So there's a directly elected county commission chair, the same thing is in Wyandotte County Unified Government. If you talk about the size, you can get a sense of where those are, where it kind of have 3, 5, and 7 commissioners, kind of gives you a sense of where that goes. So unless we talked about counties, let's talk about cities. Again, there's nothing in the U.S. Constitution about cities, but cities indeed are allowed by the state constitution. Will provide a general law applicable to all cities for the incorporation of cities and the methods by which a city boundary may be altered, merged, consolidated, etc., or dissolved. The distinction is between cities and counties is that cities indeed are municipal corporations. They're not really an extension of the state, they're a municipal corporation. You know, look at your neighborhood association and say you're going to be incorporated, i.e. that's a city. It had different laws and restrictions. Why that's important is that individuals that are a city commissioner can also be a county commissioner, can also be a state legislator, because they're not state officials. You can't hold 2 state offices at one time, but you can be a city council member, city commissioner, and be a county commissioner and or a state representative as well as one goes forward. You have large staffs and small staffs. Wichita is a very large one, or no staff at all. Lake Quivira is basically a contract entity. It's a city designed as a way to forego any sort of incorporation of annexation for other parts of Johnson County. But it basically is a municipal golf course neighborhood association that contracts all its services out for fire, police, and those sort of things. They can choose whatever services they want. You don't have to go and do any services if you don't want to do that. So you're not obligated like counties to provide services going forward. There are some legal distinctions, I think, between, now we know what counties are, and we know what cities are, and kind of general parameters of what services they provide in broad brush. Let's talk about some legal restrictions that counties and cities have. And one's called Dillon's Rule, and one's called Home Rule, and then a hybrid. What the heck does that mean? Well, Dillon's Rule goes back to the 1868. And it basically says, the controversy was, what authority do cities and counties have on their own? And what that ruling basically said is that cities and counties can only do what indeed the legislature has said specifically they can do. If it's not written into the statutes, then they don't have any authority to do that. What might be an example? Let's say a county in these Dillon Rule states, which there are several, wants to build a roadway. Do they have the authority? Do they have the authority to acquire a 60-foot roadway or 70-foot roadway? Whatever is the authorization. How deep does the subbase have to be? Does it have to be concrete? Does it have to be asphalt? All that stuff typically is laid out in the Dillon's Rule state. It's the Cook methodology of legislation. And that's been in place for quite some time, and Kansas is a hybrid in some senses to that, juxtaposing it to what we call home rule. And home rule's philosophy is that which is governed closest to home governs best. Kansas Constitution has a home rule area, and counties were granted that many years later, but by state statutes. What it basically says is, the home rule says, if indeed there is no law providing that activity, then cities and counties can do whatever they want to go ahead and opine about. They're able to go ahead and do, except unless the state government has preempted that and said, no, you can't go in that area. And that's how Kansas home rule is put together. It basically says that whatever indeed the cities are hereby empowered in the Constitution to determine their own local affairs and government, including the levying of taxes, excises, fees, charges, and other extractions, except when and as of the levying of any tax, excise, fee, charge, or other extraction is limited or prohibited by enactment of the legislature, which is applied and done uniformly to all cities of the same class. So 2 things. The state has to go and occupy that field, and they have to do it uniformly. Now, what are some examples about that? Well, one comes to mind is Saline County. Saline County did not want to go ahead, and there was a large influx of rashes of police officers being shot at and some getting killed. They didn't want to allow for firearms in Saline County. That's not, obviously, the state came in and usurped that. But there was no legislation dealing about the selling of ammunition, particularly cop killer, metal jacketed ammunition. So using home rule authority, Saline County said, we're not going to allow these certain types of ammunition to be sold in Saline County. Small idea that way. The second one comes in probably more closer to home, city of Lenexa. There's no statute in Kansas that allows for sales of liquor and beer on Sundays. In fact, it's prohibited, but it's not uniformly applied. So the city of Lenexa decided to go ahead and do a home rule ordinance to allow them to go ahead and do beer sales and liquor sales on Sundays. They passed it and put it in place, and therein lies now most cities throughout the state are using the same home rule authority to go ahead and allow for Sunday liquor sales. So that's kind of an example of how that kind of works. Basically saying whatever you want to go ahead and do, you can go ahead and legislate. Lawrence has tried to do that with plastic bags and other things going on as well, using their home rule authority. Home rule authority has been used in Johnson County for climate action activities as well, unless the state of Kansas comes in and usurps it, which is what they did in the area of plastic bag legislation, saying that's now impossible to go and do that. You saw that with sanctuary cities as well. So things that kind of look offbeat are being used by home rule authority, which I find very refreshing to deal that Kansas back in the 60s did make that decision, because I think that's the ultimate level of local control. Local governments should indeed decide for themselves how they want to go and do and proceed. Basically, it is local control for home rule as we go forward here. So those are the two distinctions. Counties, cities, where does their power come from? The Constitution, mostly in the states themselves. Limited powers depending on what the state legislature allows to go ahead and do. Kansas is a hybrid mix between home rule and some Dillon rules activities. So what do cities and counties do now that we've done that? Who does what in this kind of mix here? So what I'm going to show you is a brief video, but it's from Texas, but it's very germane to what Kansas does as well, to kind of ferret out the differences between the two.
Howdy, I'm proud to be a Texan.
Well, me too, but I'm a McLennan County gal at heart.
I live in Waco, which I guess is also McLennan County. And don't get me wrong, I'm proud to be a Texan, but I'm a city girl at heart. All that county stuff is in the country, right?
Hold on there, Missy. Whether you live in the city or not, you're just as much a part of the county as anyone else.
That's right. And your state, your city, and your county all have important jobs to do.
Are you saying that we've got 3 governments running the show here?
Yeah, that seems like a lot.
What do they all do anyway?
Well, I'm glad you asked. Let's start with you, cowboy. We all love living in the Lone Star State, but the government has a limited purpose and scope. That's one of the reasons the legislature only meets every other year. When it does, it has to make decisions and laws that apply to the entire state as a whole. And it needs a local partner to implement its laws and policies.
Well, so who does that?
I'm glad you asked. That's where the counties come in. They were created to implement state policies and enforce state laws at the local level. It's where the rubber meets the road on carrying out the state's priorities. You see, the county enforces the state's laws and policies. Counties provide services locally tailored to fit the needs of the local residents. And they can do this because they are run by the locals and connected to the people.
Yeah, but isn't the city even more local than the county?
That's a great question, one that I'm glad you asked. Cities are local and they provide services, but with limits and within the city limits. If you live in a city, they may provide things like water, electricity, and waste removal. Bigger cities have a police force, and the city may build certain streets.
Well, that sounds like everything I need. What else is there?
Well, I'm glad you asked. That brings me back to your county. Your county government fills the gap providing things that the state and city government do not. It provides law enforcement county-wide. It runs the court systems. When there are bad guys, it keeps the jails where they stay. It registers voters and holds elections for everything from local government offices to the President of the United States. Counties keep track of records like deeds, birth certificates, and death certificates. Counties build and maintain about half the roads in Texas. The county provides health care to lower-income residents. It provides emergency management during times of crisis. And the county often collects taxes on behalf of other entities like school districts and cities. Are you getting the picture?
Wow, that's a lot.
Yes, it is.
Oh, so I get it. The county is actually the political subdivision enabled by the Texas Constitution to carry out state laws, but with direct and connected relationship to the people it serves.
Very good, city gal. Yes, you are Texans and may live in the city, but remember, you are also proud county residents too.
Thank you, big voice in the sky.
Yeah, and do you have a name or something?
Well,
yeah.
Huh?
Oh, hey guys, it's me, Chet. I guess I'm just a guy who thinks county government's cool, and I thought y'all should know about some of this stuff. Anyway, see you later.
Okay.
Well, I hope you learned something because.
Texas counties deliver.
Hey.
You get the point. But I think the kind of video kind of gives you kind of a general sense of covering again what we talked about, which is neat. Counties and cities, kind of to recap some of the stuff. Counties typically have more departments than cities do. Johnson County, for example, has about 32 different departments. We'll talk about that in just a second. Have more elected officials, elected treasurer, elected clerk, elected registrar of deeds, elected sheriff, elected district attorney, plus the county commissioners itself. County commission boards are elected mostly on a partisan basis. However, Johnson County and Wyandotte County are nonpartisan, which is kind of interesting. Less flexible revenue sources than cities. We have a lot of more controls that way. Most cities and virtually all cities that now are elected on a nonpartisan basis. So when you go in the voting booth, talking to the city county commissioner for Lawrence, there's no R or D behind their names. Cities do not have mandated services, counties do. City council members can be state officials as well. We talked about that. And have more flexible sources of revenues, franchise fees, excise fees, taxes, utilities. We'll talk about that in just a moment. So cities and counties, we talked about far less authority or discretion to raise local revenues, and counties relatively more dependent on local property taxes. Management becomes a matter of county commissioners that are managers. There are some that have professional managers as well, but only about a handful do, about 17, 18 do in Kansas. There are different levels of government. You have them here. You have a basic council, a commission manager form of government here in Lawrence, strong mayor, former council members, or whatever are part of that. In most of the Kansas, larger jurisdictions, I'd say those over 10,000 have a city manager or city administrator. And larger counties have administrators as well, which I think is critical in these days to keep things moving. Organizational chart, this is what Lawrence's organizational chart looks like. The number of departments is relatively smaller in number. See Parks and Recreation, Finance, Planning and Development Services, Municipal Services Operations, Information Technology, Police, Fire, Medical, those sort of things are typically the general areas of development. Some cities will have economic development as well, but many cities use that for the Chamber of Commerce, leave it for their purposes. Contrast that with Finney County, where you have public works, building maintenance, fairgrounds, county mental health, emergency management, computer support, adult corrections, we haven't talked about that too much, youth services, juvenile detention, county appraisers, EMS, GIS services, plus look at the top there, Register of Deeds, county clerk, county commission, county treasurer, county attorney, county sheriff are all elected officials. So they duke it out for political power about who does what in certain jurisdictions. The power of the purse, however, is with the county commissioners going forward that way. But it provides, I think, an interesting dynamic that you don't necessarily have at the city commission level. This is the org chart for the city, for Johnson County. Again, look at the top there and you see elections and so forth. What you not see is Register of Deeds, clerk, or treasurer. During the time that the Johnson County put its own constitution called Charter in 2000, they eliminated those positions as being elected and then were being appointed. So they were appointed by the county manager to make sure that people had a professional expertise could take on those really functional bureaucratic positions. So that's different for Johnson County, but you can see the large labyrinth of the departments in that area. And look at the right-hand side of this when you're talking about airport and you're talking about developmental supports, library, parks and recreation. There's separate governing bodies, boards, but also part of the county operations. So it's a very large organization with 4,200 employees, almost $1.6 billion in total revenues and expenditures, including by the largest, which is the wastewater operation, which is the largest part of the county budget. The number of counties that have county administration are, you can see in dark gray here. And I think that list will be expanding, although maybe not too rapidly as counties are shrinking in population out west compared to what currently exists now. Let's talk about property taxes real briefly, but I'm gonna stop here for a second. I was gonna stop in a second. I want to pause here and take a 5-minute break here for about 5 minutes, 15 minutes, 7:45. Do take a 5-minute break, and I don't want it to be longer than that. But if you could be so kind as to write down on those cards special topics you're interested in. So I want to spend the remainder of our time, if we can, before questions and so forth, answering questions you may have about city and county government, either here locally or statewide. Does that make sense? Okay. So 5-minute break. Give me your questions. Just bring them up here when you get them done. I've got pens as well. That's right. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it. And if you don't want to write down your questions, that's fine. We'll have time at the end for questions as well. Sure. Our viewing audience here. Thank you. Okay. Some of these are coming up. We'll try to cover all these. We will. All right, some of these are dealing with taxes and some are dealing with size of jurisdictions as we go forward here. Let's take the ones before with regards to the size of county commissioners, because we just covered that a second ago. Question was 3 or 5 county commissioners, why or why not? What do you see as the advantages or disadvantages of 3 or 5 county commissioners for Douglas County? I think that it really becomes a political decision about the size of commissioners for each community. I think the advantage is by having larger numbers that they can focus more on constituent services. So they have you have a large number of commissioners handling a smaller number of people as far as their jurisdictions are concerned. I don't see a great deal of disadvantages to that process. I think the other advantage is that you still can't go ahead and talk with other commissioners. We're violating open meetings law. The disadvantage is you have to go ahead and convince, get votes to 3 versus votes to 2 to go ahead and do anything. That could be an advantage, can be a disadvantage. I think it depends on how the districts are put together. Most counties divide since we already talked about having a city or a county seat in the center, most county commissions decide it in a pie, as opposed to having the city be kind of their own jurisdiction. So it can dilute some of the urban, I think, influence versus the rural influence as you go forward that way, dividing into more areas, depending how the districts are put together. It really is more, I think, a decision on how people feel like they want to interact. Negative side as well, I guess you've got to pay for 2 more people because the county commissioners get paid something, and that all varies depending on what they're getting paid. Some of them get paid in the areas of $60,000 to $90,000 a piece. So if you have 2 more, then that becomes an issue if they don't have a county manager. If they have a county manager, and those salaries tend to come down to provide for a county manager. That might be the upside and downside. Does that help for those who asked that question? Yeah. Okay. Good. It's a great question. Yes, ma'am. Yes. County commissioners decide the districts. The districts have to be proportional in terms they have to have the same number of people in it. It's much like the legislature went through the district redistricting process as well. So every 10 years, the county commissioner has to equalize the number of people in each district, and how they do that, it's a political decision. Yes, sir. Well, he probably is talking about the precincts versus the district commissions themselves. I'm unaware that any treasurer has the ability to just make the actual commission districts themselves. Pardon? Well, that would be news to me. Typically, it has to happen by the county commissioners to make that vote. He may indeed propose, though, but I would submit that has to be approved by the county commission. It'd be unusual for me to think they don't. That has to be that is the case in Johnson County, I know. It would be unusual if other counties don't have similar approval to have the county commissioners approve the jurisdictions. Okay. Let me move on to some other points here. Taxes, let's talk about that. Property taxes, right? History of property taxes. It is the earliest known tax records dating from approximately 6000 BC. We've hated property taxes for a long time as humanity, right? Because it becomes part of that stuff in a form of clay tablets found in ancient city of Lagash in modern day Iraq. So that was the kind of the first tax bill. Primary focus of early property taxation, it was the land and its production value. Taxes were levied against the value of grain, cattle, oil, and beer. I point these 2 things out because look on the left, you see that kind of house that kind of is cantilevered out. That's a unique way to avoid property taxes, because you had a property tax based upon the square footage you occupied. So let's go ahead and cantilever out and make it kind of larger to occupy that space. The right thing is, an Italian community, writ large, regular, that these tall buildings occupy very small pieces of property, but you could build as high as you wanted to. And most very affluent people in Italy built very, very tall houses to go ahead and reduce their property taxes. So very clever way to do it. The Rosetta Stone was actually a tax document granting exemptions to priests. So we've had tax exemptions for a long time as well. We talk about property taxes. So just give me the landscape that we like to gripe about property taxes, but I think Humanity has trying to argue with this issue, what's a fairer way to go ahead and do it? And if you can find a fair, part of the best way of taxes is don't tax you, don't tax me, tax the person behind the tree, right? That's how most people feel, but it's that argument's been going on for thousands of years. That's my point with this. In Kansas, there are some fundamental issues you should look at, and in most places, when they're being appraised value versus assessed value. Now, the appraised value is what indeed the property we think you could sell it for. Okay, that becomes the appraised value. And there's a whole list of mandatory items to go ahead and figure out what the appraised value is. That's different than the assessed value. The assessed value is what we decide to go ahead and provide on taxes. And Kansas Constitution, it says that you take the appraised value, and if you're a residential property, you take 11.5% of the appraised value. If you're ag, it's 30% of the income-based value of the property. If your utilities, is 33%. If you're commercial and industrial, it's 25%. That gives you then the appraised value, the assessed value on your appraised property. So the assessed value is the idea of 1 mil is $1 per $1,000 of assessed valuation, and we'll get more to that as far as that's concerned. But that's what a mil is concerned. It is $1 of property tax per $1,000 of assessed value, not appraised value, as you go forward. So what does an appraiser do? Let's talk about that.
So there's a lot of misunderstanding about the role of appraisers and how they affect the property tax that homeowners pay. When someone hears the term appraiser, they seem to think of a scary figure reaching for their wallet. Not so. Appraisers don't set tax rates. Appraisers don't chase tax dollars. An appraiser is interested in fairly determining property values, and they take great pride in it. Property tax is determined by a simple formula. Appraisers only affect one of these variables, the value, and they do so with incredible accuracy. Appraisers aren't tax collectors or even tax setters. They're just fellow taxpayers, and their primary goal is to make everything fair and equitable. Imagine that you are in a restaurant with two friends. One orders a hot dog, one a plate of caviar, and you order a steak. The waiter comes to the table with a total bill of $100, but he doesn't know how much each of you should pay. If everyone paid the same amount, the guy who ordered caviar might be happy. But what about the guy who ordered a hot dog? Enter appraisers. The food is your property. Just like these meals, some people's property is worth more than others. And it's the appraiser's job to determine how much each property is worth. That's it. So, in the same way the value of these menu items would need to be determined, an appraiser places values on properties to ensure fairness and equity. After the appraiser determines the value of each property, local governing bodies will set their budgets for the coming year. They set the tax rate in order to produce the dollars needed for their budgets. The value of a property does not affect the amount of property tax needed. The sum total of all these budgets is a set number that has to be divided up among all the property owners. So even if everyone's value was cut in half by the appraisers, the tax rate would be raised in order to generate the same amount of tax revenue. The appraisers don't determine the taxes you pay. They just determine the values of properties to keep everything as fair and equitable as possible. When you notice a change in your property's appraised value, the change is the result of a never-ending quest for fairness and accuracy. Appraisers are graded on their performance, so there is a detailed system to get accurate valuations. First, the appraiser looks at similar properties that have sold, their sale prices, and the terms and conditions of each sale. That's the reason your home won't just be compared to the place next door. Studying things like square footage, age, and location helps appraisers determine how comparable another property is to yours. Even seemingly small details, like an extra bathroom or finished basement, can result in significant differences in value in two otherwise identical homes. Appraisers maintain a thorough database of real estate information to make this process as precise as possible. Changes in value are typically the result of local real estate market sales or major changes to a property. Remodel a kitchen or finish your basement, and your property's value could increase. When you see your home's appraised value, you can rest assured that the number has not been drawn out of a hat, nor generated with anything but equity and accuracy in mind. Long story short, appraisers are here to help, not trying to hinder. Their focus is accurate values, not tax collection. The only things an appraiser chases are fairness and equity, and they take great pride in it.
That's a kind of nice little video here, but I think the important thing is that really is, I think the appraiser's office gets a bad rap. They're really trying to go ahead and establish what is the fair market value of your property. The accuracy really is pretty phenomenal. In Johnson County, the comparison of the appraised value versus the sale price, which really was the value is roughly about 3% below what the sales price actually is. Many people would say, well, you know, Hannes, I'm really upset about my appraised value. It's too high. I'm saying, well, let me ask you about that. Would you sell your house for what we have it appraised at? It's, oh, no, it's worth more than that. Then what are you complaining about? You know, what's the point here? If you can find a better way to go ahead and do the system, let me know. We'll find that way to go ahead and do it. I would challenge anybody to find more fair ways to go ahead and do it than what the appraiser's office try to go on a routine basis. Kansas made a very good decision a few years ago to say that indeed properties had to be appraised on an annual basis. So we try to go a fair situation as we go out the time, not letting things lag or go behind as time goes forward. So you don't see large spikes going up or large spikes going down with the value. And yes, property values do go down. In 2008, we had a significant number of all our properties in Johnson County lose value. And people really don't want to lose value for their primary real estate, their home, as far as that's concerned. So I wanted to show you that clip to let you know about what the appraised value and how that comes into play. So again, the appraised value of your home multiplied by the appraised value by the assessment percentage gives the assessed value. In this case, a home would be 11.5%. Once you get that idea of the assessed value, you take that amount times the mill levy and then divide it by 1,000, and that gives you your annual amount that you have to go ahead and pay on an annual basis with 2 installments in Kansas. This is our property tax bill last year for our house in Johnson County. And you can see the amounts for each one. I would challenge you to go home and look at your property tax statement, because it lines out individually each individual jurisdiction, fire district, sewer district, stormwater fees, whatever, that kind of get all add up to your property taxes, so you get a better sense of really what you're paying for. And it really is that location specific, because yours may be different than your neighbor, because your neighbor might be in a different school district, might be in a different cemetery district, might be in a different storm sewer area. So it really is kind of individually located jurisdictions. And becomes a strong feat for the tax collectors to make sure that everything is accurate and up to snuff. If you haven't looked at the tax statements, let's be honest about it, that property taxes, typically statewide, half or more of the property taxes goes to schools. A good portion of Johnson County goes to cities, and the remaining portion goes to the county, community college, library, parks, and the state of Kansas as a small sliver as well. So when you talk about property taxes, getting understanding of who gets what certainly is helpful. Where do you find that information? Well, this is kind of information you can find. I'm sure Douglas County has this as well. It tells you kind of on an annual basis what each jurisdiction has, what their mill levy is in the areas. You can't read all the numbers here, but it lets you know the subheadings. The state has a certain portion, 1.5 mills, county taxes, library, parks, recreation, cemeteries, drainage districts, fire districts, townships. Yes, townships, of which are also covered ubiquitously in Kansas by and large, can also do taxes as well. Recreation Commission, townships in general. Then you've got cities and you've got schools. So it can be this information is available for you to figure out exactly which portions have come up or come down, and a very detailed report as things go forward. That's property taxes. We can talk more about that as we talk about it. We'll talk about one of the questions about property taxes as well. Consolidation standards for facilities. We'll talk about that in a second. Well, let's talk about this. It says, would county consolidation result in lower property taxes is one of the questions. Not necessarily, depending on how counties are structured, but I will tell you that there's something to the idea of economies of scale. What's my example? Johnson County. Johnson County has the lowest mill levy of all 105 counties in the state of Kansas, probably by about 18 mills versus the next one being close to about 35 mills. Maybe about 50% lower than the nearest one. Now, that's not all surprising given the amount of value in Johnson County. I get it. But if you look at the amount of dollars collected per $1,000 of valuation, we are at the bottom. We're about 98 out of 105 counties. So that idea of economies of scales does come into play, where you have probably less overhead in terms of some administrative positions and some sharing of resources for fire. For police and those services. There might be some, I think, value that way, depending on the number of jurisdictions. Were the fire districts in Johnson County to consolidate, would that be more efficient? I think it would. You'd probably have fewer pumper trucks. You'd probably have fewer chiefs. You'd probably have fewer training facilities. So there is some of that. But on the other hand, communities can dictate what kind of services they want to have. We all get welded to the area we're at. Countryside would be a good example. Countryside was a very small city in Johnson County that got basically, they dissolved themselves and got absorbed into Mission. But it took about 20 years to convince that neighborhood of about 150 homes to go ahead and give up their countryside deal, even though their property taxes would have been cut in half. They wanted to go and keep on paying that because they were welded to the term countryside. They're welded to that neighborhood. And so people have a right to go ahead and do that. So it depends on kind of where you are and what consolidation means. So I think in general, it may help to consolidate, but it also becomes a matter of what is the public will and what is the desire to do it. One of the earliest areas of consolidation was the city of Indianapolis. And they consolidated many, many things within that jurisdiction, except for one, that being fire departments. So people got welded to their fire. They wanted to have their fire department engine coming to their community versus somebody else's area community. And that would have saved a ton of cash, but they wanted to go and maintain their identity with regards to that community. So good question, good session. Let's talk about other taxes. Let me talk about it as well. Consolidation. What is the advantage of consolidated government in Wyandotte County or Riley County? Law enforcement consolidation. Do you anticipate or recommend that more city-county consolidation happens in the near future? I think consolidation is a good thing as we talk about 105 counties, particularly out west, where you have some counties that have 1,200 people in it, 2,000 people. I think it would be difficult to maintain a level of service in some of those counties. Some counties have so few population, case in point, I won't name the county, but they had an individual who was on the road crew who got a DUI, was drunk, and got fired several times. They couldn't find anybody else to run the motor grader, so they rehired the same person. So I think consolidation would allow more people to kind of come together to provide those services. I think that is an eventuality, but as the Constitution says, the entities have to agree to go ahead and vote on that for their consolidation. And it becomes, again, the series of identity. I grew up in X county. My parents grew up in X county. I don't want to see X county go away. And they will fight very vigorously to go and maintain that area of jurisdiction. And that's their right. They want to go ahead and do it. But there's an expense for that. And they got to be willing to go ahead and pay it if they want to go ahead and do it. And many are willing to do that. But I do think the future talks about consolidation in the future. With regards to law enforcement consolidation, Riley County several decades ago established a police commission. They do not have a sheriff. They appointed their law enforcement officer as a way to go ahead and say, if you're not doing the right thing, then indeed we're going to say goodbye to you and bring somebody else in and not have to wait for 4 more years for that to occur. I know it's on the ballot here coming up as well. Let you all make your own decisions. My personal viewpoint is that if it's good for that one county, why can't they have the same options for 104 counties? Why shouldn't counties have that option as well? Why is it just Riley County? If you don't think it's appropriate, then indeed everybody should not be allowed to go ahead and have their own police commission. They should be required to go ahead and do a vote as well. I think it is seems unfair. I'll leave it there. So that good questions that way. Some of these questions talking about sales taxes. Let's talk about sales taxes real quickly. Sales taxes. Sales taxes in general. Kansas is one of 45 states, plus a district that does have a sales tax. The sales tax was enacted in 1937. It's been around for a long time here. The rate of 2% increasing over the years to a current rate of 6.5%. Alaska, Delaware, Montana, New Hampshire, and Oregon do not have a general sales or use tax. We'll talk about those differences in a second. What is tax though? Retail sales, rental and lease, intangible personal property and utilities, food, we all know about that. Labor services on tangible personal property, that's important. Admissions, meals and drinks, motor vehicles, those sort of things. You can look that up if you want to get more information. What I find interesting is what's not taxed. Labor services other than personal property, doctors, lawyers, accountants, etc. No sales tax on that stuff. And what part of the economy has been expanding over the last 20 or 30 years? It's services, and continue to do that sort of activity. We don't tax that. Aircraft, you buy a $45 million aircraft, Learjet, you don't pay a farthing in sales tax. Broadcast equipment, why I can't tell you. Drill bits, okay, we had an oil industry. Veterinarian drugs, farm equipment and machinery. So that, that $500,000 tractor that farmers buy, no sales tax on that. That's, you'll be buying, grain and so forth and see no sales tax on that. And anything they deal with the farming industry is all exempt from sales tax. Railroad parts, materials used in interstate commerce, plus a slug of others. How many? Look in the statute book, about 4 or 5 pages, single-spaced of exemptions from sales taxes. My argument is here is that it becomes a major generator for us, for communities particularly, but we keep on eroding the number of folks that actually are paying sales taxes. It becomes difficult to go in and make that a reasonable revenue source. Countywide taxes, if you're countywide, actually shares that money with the cities. So the county may put in place a half-cent sales tax, but guess what? A majority of that goes to the city. So the county has more difficult to raise revenue as one goes forward. Counties are limited to a 1 cent total sales tax of all the various kind of interventions, although there are a plethora of exemptions to that going beyond that area. Cities are limited to 3 cents. So cities are really kind of in a driving force to go ahead and use sales tax revenues as a way to reduce property taxes. Hayes has decided years ago to go ahead and put in sales taxes to the max to reduce almost having no property taxes for city government. So we'll see how that continues in the future. 89 counties impose sales taxes, and use tax is a relatively new one, purchases from out-of-state retailers when sales tax not collected. That's the internet sales activities. Use tax has been growing left and right. There have been some issues about collection of those taxes. Kansas has been one of the few states that have been joined a consortium that has allowed retailers to go ahead and collect sales taxes for internet sales, but that's still being worked out in terms of how all gets worked through. Nationwide, Kansas has a total kind of average sales tax rate about 8.75. And you can see through here, maybe not very clearly, what other sales taxes have. The darker the red, the darker the amount of the sales tax. You can see Oregon, Montana, and other places have no sales taxes whatsoever. This talks about percent of change in sales tax. I find this interesting the last 10 years during COVID, or last 2 years during COVID. All these are positive numbers in terms of increase in sales tax collections. The amount of money that the federal government put in place in terms of the payroll protection program, et cetera, has had a benefit in providing more revenue of sales taxes for local jurisdictions, in my opinion. Per capita sales taxes as well. You can see here the darker red, that means more sales taxes are collected in those jurisdictions. The white areas are less, which means you can kind of see where the areas are drawing people into to purchase what they call the draw factor, the pull factor. You can kind of see where those areas are. Johnson County certainly is one of those, but also areas in western Kansas. That's sales taxes. The issue about how can we lower sales taxes on groceries, you got to convince the state legislature to do it. Again, that's one of those areas by Dillon's rule that the state has occupied and occupy universally, saying here's how sales taxes will be collected. There is, I think, some challenge for us if we eliminate all sales tax on groceries, which I personally support in terms of being a regressive tax. The reality is that's a major part of the sales tax collections. So if you then shrink this balloon over here on sales taxes, something has to expand over here to take its place. Will that be property taxes? I don't know. We'll see. I don't see things getting cheaper. Things are getting more expensive and there's more demands for services. That's going to be a conversation we'll have to have. What's the idea? I'll get that later on. So that talks about sales taxes. Other taxes come into place. There's motor vehicle taxes that cities and counties are able to go ahead and receive as well, which is formidable. User fees. Cities have the ability to collect fees on water and sewer. Ambulance services, yes, you get billed for ambulance services. The ambulance is there available to you and property taxes pay for that. But if you get hauled someplace, there's a fee for that. And communities and jurisdictions will mess with that rate depending on how much they can get from insurance companies or Medicare, Medicaid, et cetera. Most people go around the Medicare rate. User fee, talked about that, permits, building permits, et cetera. Water and sewer is interesting because some communities will use that, and electric utilities as well, to offset the property taxes. Ottawa, for example, has a continual amount of dollars coming from their electric utility over to the general fund to reduce property taxes. So many cities are allowed to do that, and some do it with great aplomb. Gas taxes are part of that. Cities get a certain portion of it, but to kind of give you a sense that 18.4 cents is the federal portion of your gas taxes, plus an additional 24 cents for the state of Kansas. There is a portion that comes back to cities and counties that helps for roads as well. Motor vehicle tax, excise fees, cities yes, county no. Excise fees and franchise fees are those fees excise fees to go ahead and help pay for development that occurs in a community that puts a burden on services. A new subdivision comes in place that puts a burden on fire, police, and EMS, those activities. There's an excise fee to go ahead and say basically compensate us for that additional services you're putting on a burden as far as that's concerned. Cities can do that, counties cannot, which is kind of interesting. Gas tax prices lets you know where we are compared to the rest of the country. You can see Illinois, California, and others are higher than Kansas, but we're in the mix. Missouri, this is an old data. They just increased their gas tax here recently. So that kind of talks about taxes as far as that's concerned. Topics of interest. Let me make sure I answer your questions. What is the ideal qualification for city and county government leaders? I think two things. One, the elected officials is different, I think, than the appointed official. If you're the elected official, I think, is one that is probably less qualifications and more of interest. And I think for me at the local level, there's a distinction between what I call being an agent versus a trustee. An agent would be somebody that has a desired outcome. I vote for you to go ahead and make sure this subdivision doesn't go in place, which I think is fairly myopic and does not help the community. A trustee is one that says, I am here to go ahead and make the best decision on behalf of the community writ large. For those that indeed voted for me, those who didn't vote for me, those who chose not to vote, and those who couldn't vote. That to me is the trustee activity. So for me, it is more important to bring someone who has the attitude of being a trustee than being an agent, because that one issue that person champions may be very important. That will be one of 1,000 other issues they have to confront during their tenure in office. So that to me is a qualification, is being reasonable and doing what I think is appropriate to listen to all sides of the argument and the issue that's there, and to make the best decision on behalf of the community that's best for not this generation, but the next generation. So it's attitude more than anything else. Willingness to learn, willingness to listen, and willingness to go ahead and question the consequences of their decision. That to me is a qualification. It's individuals who really have the community at heart. I'm not running for office. That's just kind of my viewpoint of it. Yeah. I think for an appointed official, somebody who has experience running organizations in a government sector. Running a government organization is distinctly different than running an organization in the private sector. Not good or bad, they're just uniquely different. And here's the big difference. The big difference, if you're in the private sector, you have a profit motive. That's not bad, but you have stockholders, you have to go ahead and make a profit. And that changes your mindset, as opposed to working for government where you're there for public service. Governments do things that don't pay, that indeed don't make money, and that's why they're doing that kind of work, or shouldn't be charged to be making money. And I think that's a whole different mindset that way. I think individuals who've been trained in this kind of work, have experience, have a leg up on those that do not. And I think that's an important measure as one goes forward. It's a profession like anything else. Here's a good measure. Would you, these are corporations. So in Johnson County, it's a $1.6 billion corporation. Would you invest in a corporation where the chief executive officer has no experience running that corporation? Or has any experience and doesn't have a business degree? I wouldn't. So the same sort of thing exists for local governments as well. People who have the experience and understanding of this myriad of professions and can do it in a fishbowl is a whole different kettle of fish. I hope I haven't irritated too many people. Another question, are there any specific standards set for county medical health facilities? There are specific standards. They have to go ahead and meet the standards for everybody else that in the private sector, both in terms of the hospital as well as nursing home facilities. So they're not absent of that. They are required to go and meet those same state standards. Now, one can argue, is the state standard enough to provide quality care? And I think they are. It becomes a matter of constant vigilance to make sure that they're actually meeting up to those expectations. But same standards, they don't get a break as far as that's concerned. I want to pause here for a second. You can see some of the listing here of items we could talk about. Annexation, comprehensive plans, incentives, tax incentives. We can talk about issues of nursing homes, partnerships with local governments, redistricting, et cetera. Lots of different things we can talk about. But I want to pause here to see if you have questions I have not covered. And then we might kind of end up with kind of tax incentives if nobody has additional questions. Questions you all have? Yes, ma'am. No problem. Okay. What's the process to encourage your county commissioners to increase the numbers? Okay. Mm-hmm. Well, the way you would do it by any sort of political activist efforts, you start talking to them. And you research what other counties of similar size might have in terms of if there are other counties that are of same size population or larger or smaller that have 5 versus 3, that would be an argument in your favor to go and increase the size. Bringing forward the ideas about why you want to increase it, what kind of are the reasons to do that. For the person in a 3-member commission going to 5 is difficult for them in some cases because it reduces their political power, right? So you've got to convince them about why that is a good thing for the community to go ahead and have more people involved in representation and trusteeship of the county. So there's no magic here. It's a matter of trying to convince your political officials to do it. I'm not aware, but maybe you can do a petition to encourage the change in county membership. I have to do some more research about that, and that might be an option. But the first, I think, option is to have a conversation with the county commissioners and those previous county commissioners about why you think it's a good idea and why the current system does not represent the interests of the community at large. Mm-hmm. Yes, sir. Depends on which, and the question was, does the state have any jurisdiction over local government incentives? Did I say that correctly? And the answer is yes and no. They have abdicated some, it depends on which tool they look at. If you were talking about star bonds, which is the big issue right now, the state of Kansas has a great deal of jurisdiction of that. Star bonds basically allows the entity to go ahead and harvest the full amount of increased sales tax revenues, including the portion for the state itself, to help pay for infrastructure and other amenities for a project. So the state has a great deal of influence in that. For industrial revenue bonds, typically talking about that, and property tax abatements that are associated with that, the state has very little control as long as the entity meets the statutory requirements. It's done for eliminating blight and so forth, and indeed has a cost-benefit analysis that have been approved. If they meet those thresholds, then indeed the state does not interfere with that. And the state probably doesn't want to because the state reaps the benefits of those economic development ideas. Industrial revenue bond activities, the state's not giving up resources, the local community is, as a way to entice industries to come in. And of course, the state gets a great deal of revenue if an industry comes in based on income taxes and other taxes that the cities and counties don't have access to. So it's not in their interest to go ahead and curtail those type of incentives very much. They provide the tools, and the local jurisdictions then go ahead and use those tools in a way they think is best for their community. Does that help? Another question over here, yes. Depends on what the risk is. The question is being, does Panasonic bring with it rewards and risks? I'll phrase it that way. And I think there are risks depending on what sort of incentives the individual jurisdiction provides. Let's take, for example, that that there's a community improvement district that gets part of that. One of the various many tools that's out there. Community improvement district allows an entity. There's not much retail. Might be some retail. I'll tell you that. Let me back up. Special assessment district might be a better way to do it. Let's say that Panasonic wants to use special assessment district financing to put in place all the water, sewer, and those sort of things. You're banking on that development going ahead and having that property, that area is going to develop and have enough property value to pay off those bonds. If indeed those property value is not increased at that point, then indeed the city or jurisdiction has to pick up and pay off those bonds. There's a risk. What would that be an example to be? There was a community out in central Kansas, I will not name the name, that indeed used special assessment bonds quite a bit to go ahead and put in infrastructure for housing development if that was going to happen. The housing development didn't occur, and the community then was saddled with paying off that debt. Hayes had that experience back in the 1980s when we had the savings and loan crisis, and we had individual communities, various amounts of Travenol was the big industry there, left the community. So the community itself had to go and pick up the bag, if you will, to pay off those bonds. That's the risk. I don't think there's going to be a great deal of risk with this one. I've not heard many entities issuing debt that way yet. They might indeed ask for industrial revenue bonds, which then basically allows Panasonic to finance the infrastructure of a building by virtue of tax exempt bonds and get tax abatements. The risk is that they would not be able to go and service that debt. But then in that case, the community has the asset. They have the building, which probably has value as well. So it's a measured risk as one goes forward. And one has to be wise about it. Communities have to be wise about what sort of investment they're making and what they're giving up and what they hope to get. Yeah, so it's a calculated risk. Yes, sir. Yep, that's correct. So they're going to have the debt to go ahead and service. Their hope is that somebody else will occupy those buildings, and they have the building itself. So you have that asset, but there is a risk there. I think the Wyandotte County typically has done a very good job of trying to manage that risk with other entities coming in place. It would be hard to argue that the Legends has not been a good example of economic development. It's been a hell of a project so far, but those are the risks. Exactly right. Yeah, I'm not. I don't argue with you, and that's the level of risk. I think there is, that governing bodies have to have to understand how far they want to do the risk, what they're going to gain, and have to understand that they're obligating future generations, or at least future taxpayers, for the decisions they're making. Now, on the other hand, if they don't take that risk, somebody else very well might, and then you lose that opportunity. So that's the big dynamic, I think, in economic development incentives. I've not heard any public official, not any public official, said they like economic development incentives. What I have heard, and it's probably true, is that if they don't do it, somebody else will. And there's some truth to that. And businesses are very, very willing to go ahead and play one against the other to go ahead and get what they want to go ahead and have. I'm not a real fan of in my 35 years ago, there was a thing called the but-for statement. But for this incentive, the industry wouldn't locate here. I think that is more difficult to justify these days. I think businesses are very smart. They locate in places that they know that the market's there, or the employment base is there, or the location to various transportation corridors are there, and that's where they're going to locate. And once they make that decision, then they'll ask for incentives. Now, we probably encourage that because there have been several legislation to go ahead and say that to increase stockholder value, you're obligated to look at all those incentives to increase stockholder value. So we speak out of both sides of our mouth sometimes as an American society. Not trying to be political, that's the way I see it. Other questions? I could talk for several more hours, but I see the clock on the wall said it is 7:30. I will go through this stuff and just kind of end up with this, that I want to say, I had all stuff about tax abatements, but you don't want to know about it. I could go on and on about that. Special districts, et cetera, et cetera. I just want to say thank you. Thank you for letting me do this kind of work here and for kind of giving you some enlightenment. I'm certainly happy to go and answer other questions there. My contact information is here. I want to thank Kansas Humanities for allowing me to go and make this presentation. And hopefully I've been able to go ahead and give you some insight into local governments, that particularly city and county governments. Thank you very much. Yes, we're adjourned.